In Titus 2, older women are commanded to teach what is good so they can help younger women love their husbands and children. On today's show, you'll hear from older women who will share timeless, relevant biblical wisdom and personal, profound life experiences to help answer your questions and teach what God says is good so you can be the wife and mother you were created to be. Welcome to another episode of Older Women Likewise.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. We are glad you have tuned in to Older Women Likewise for our program on dealing with depression. As you can see, we have quite a panel here with us this evening. Janice McDonald is with us traveling, and you are in a hotel room somewhere, aren't you, Janice?
Orlando, yep.
Wonderful, not too far from me. And Beth Stuckey, as you know, my oldest daughter, is in Austin? No.
San Antonio.
Oh, okay. She's out in Texas then, and also at a hotel room. So they're world travelers these days. Jill Yopp is home in Leesburg with close to me as well. But Cindy, where have you gotten to these days?
Well, I'm not too far from you. I'm in Defuniak Springs on the 20th, and so we're enjoying a few weeks here. We'll be in Florida most of the winter.
Wonderful. That's great. We are so glad. I appreciate everybody for joining the panel this evening to talk about dealing with depression. It's no secret, I'm old. I have been through so many experiences in life in talking with women, men and women who have dealt with depression. And I always wondered, why is it we don't talk about this? Why is it we're not saying much to one another about it? It's almost like it's a shame to have any kind of depression. And I was thinking about that today, and I remembered in the 1960s and 70s, there was a little pill called Valium that was overly prescribed to men and to women who had anxiety or sadness or just the blues. And this will perk you up and make you feel better. Well, as you can imagine, it also was addictive, and it just destroyed many homes and lives, careers, marriages, and was such a problem. And I think that a lot of times women and Christians had such a backlash against any kind of medicine that would help someone with a genuine depression that they just said, just forget it. We're just not going to talk about it. Just pray and everything will be fine. And that's good for many people. For many people, they've got a certain kind of sadness, and we'll talk about that some tonight. But there are other sadnesses and depressions that really need more, that need, besides what God can do for us spiritually, it needs more physically. And Janice is going to talk some about how some depressions are linked to what we eat and our hormones. Janice?
Hi, thank you so much. You know, it was about 11 months ago that I got to be on the program sharing my story of overcoming food addiction. And I think that video is available on YouTube if you were to look up Older Women Likewise, The Joy of Overcoming Food Addiction, if that's something that interests you. And I started that journey because of the pain of obesity. But one of the shocking side effects for me was how my brain functioned when I removed flour and sugar from my diet. And so it really set me on a long journey of listening to a lot of doctors through lectures on YouTube and podcasts to try and understand what is it that I'm experiencing, because there was so much pain for so long with regards to how food was impacting me that went beyond. And we look at food as far as how does it impact the shape of our body, but it really was changing the way my brain allowed me to process the ups and downs of life. And so anyways, one of the doctors that I've come in contact with, and I really enjoy his writing, is Dr. Robert Lustig. And he wrote a book called The Hacking of the American Mind. The subtitle of it is The Science Behind the Corporate Takeovers of Our Bodies and Brains. And he discusses in this book our dopamine receptors, and how in our society now we've conflated the terms pleasure and happiness. And we are such a pleasure-driven society, and the pleasure pathway in our brain is our dopamine receptors. And one of the big triggers of that is in our food system. And so if it's okay, I'd like to just read a little section here of what he wrote. He said, both high glycemic index diets, which would be the highly refined carbohydrates from processed foods, and high added sugar diets are correlated with depression. But we know that correlation is not causation. They're just correlated. So he asks, does sugar cause depression, or do depressed people consume sugar to give themselves what little pleasure they can muster? Is sugar consumption a contributor of the depressed state, or is addiction a necessary intermediate step between sugar consumption and depression? And he goes on to say that the answer to all of those is a definite maybe. So even the medical society, as they're looking at this, aren't really positive. But I thought it was very interesting when he said all of the items in the grocery store, of all of them, sugar is the only one that is independently associated with depression, addiction, and metabolic syndrome. And that it is the cheapest way to pleasure and the surest path to unhappiness. It has been a tremendous book to read about understanding what is happening to our pleasure pathway and how that overstimulation from all the ways that it comes to us in our pleasure-driven society, what it does to our system to really impede our ability to enjoy, have true happiness. So for me, removing flour and sugar, the reason I came to that through my food addiction program was because of the pain of obesity. But the reason I stick with it now is because what it has done to help my mind be able to process, and that freedom that has come from that. And so I just would like to encourage anyone who's fighting these things to maybe look at it, just consider, is it possible that the food I'm eating is contributing to this, and there's not a pill that is going to help this? I'm not anti-medicine. There are definite times when we need to see doctors and to let the medicine do the work we need. But is it possible that the food we eat could also be part of the medicine that we use to help heal our bodies? It's been that way for me on my journey. I hope that people who are struggling with that would be willing to go back and watch the other episode that we recorded, because there's just no need to suffer. And it's so hard to swim. When you pull this stuff out of your diet, you're swimming upstream from the norm of what's around us. But it's so worth it for the freedom that comes.
One of our viewers has asked us to share the name of the book that you're referring to. Would you mind to show it?
It's called The Hacking of the American Mind by Dr. Robert Lustig.
And the program that you spoke of way back on OWL was?
Yes, it's called Bright Line Eating. And that's by Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson. She is a cognitive neuroscientist. So her program brings cognitive neuroscience along with 12-step recovery and kind of blends them together and really helps you understand the addictive nature of both flour and sugar, that highly refined processed food.
Right. There are other things. Beth, didn't we learn about in treating autism? Don't they do something with, is it ADD, ADHD, and they do something with diet as well, aren't there?
Yes, but I can't remember. It's in the way back in my memory.
Yeah.
I do know that the red food dye makes some kids super duper crazy and not good.
Right. So, yeah. And so I think, Janice, that's really valuable information for us. If you are feeling depressed, if you are not feeling yourself or as happy as you would like to be, look at your diet and see whether or not that might be something that is controlling you. Any other comments? No. Okay. Beth is going to talk some with us tonight about temporary situational sadness that might lead to depression. What is the Christian woman to do in times like that, Beth?
Well, I wanted to start out by talking about the Psalms. So there's 150 Psalms, and many of them are full of David's cries to God. And we often think of David as a warrior and a king and a man after God's own heart. But when we look at the events of his life, he was very often traumatized by events surrounding him. When he was little more than a boy, the king was trying to kill him. His loss of his best friend Jonathan, which, you know, something as close as they were when Jonathan died, that was a pretty big loss for him. Plus, just that Jonathan's father was trying to kill him too. The loss of the baby with Bathsheba, the stress of running a kingdom, the situation with his children Amnon and Tamar and Absalom, the betrayal of his son, the rebellion, and then the death of Absalom, and the betrayal of his counselor Ahithophel, who he had worked with for so long. And there's a reference to that in Psalm 55 as well. I wanted to read the first few verses of Psalm 69. I think it's a really good description of what depression can feel like. And I love how David pours out his heart. In a lot of these Psalms, you see, I think, a picture of that situational, that temporary sadness. So Psalm 69, verse 1 says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my Lord." So in the verses here, we see like a really good, I call it a word picture. I don't know if that's right. That's what I like to call it, of depression. The idea of the waters around your neck. You're about to go under. I can't take anymore. I'm sinking in the depths like quicksand. Like the harder you try to get out, the deeper you go. The floods engulf me. I'm worn out, crying for help. My throat's parched. My eyes fail. There's no more tears to cry. I can't see any hope for the future. This panic and hopelessness that we see in there. There's other examples in the scriptures. We talked about Elijah, Job, Moses, Jeremiah, many others. Even Jonah gives us a good, bad example of how to deal with that sort of thing. And this type of depression, it can be caused by a variety of stressors. Sometimes it's just a one-time event, like death of a loved one or a violent crime or something like that. Or it can be kind of like a constant situation, abuse, and that kind of thing. Depression is in the steps they have of recovering, of the grieving process. Depression is one of those steps. And it's actually, I thought it was interesting, listed right before the steps where you kind of start getting better. You kind of start doing better. But that depression is part of the grieving process. Often, most of us are going to face that at some point in our lives. And it is good to know how to deal with it. For me, I like this idea of staying in the present and being mindful. We just talked about how bad sugar is, so I hate to use this example, but I'm going to anyway. So when you're having like staying mindful, staying like right in the present, to me means every small happiness that I can get from any situation. So a Hershey's kiss, just savor it, and enjoy that one little moment, and try to find something that gives you some happiness in the moment. Is one way, I think, one thing that helps.
Yeah, and that's good. Anybody else have anything y'all wanted to say? Except Janice would put broccoli in there instead.
Yes, broccoli is not going to bring you happiness with far as food, but I think it's important that we just recognize all of us are going to go through those times. We're not called to just have joy all the time, as far as we're not going to, you couldn't live in a state of always being happy. It would be too much. And so I've been reading a lot of Viktor Frankl lately. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and I'm reading his book now, The Doctor and the Soul. And he's talking a lot about that we have to find meaning in our suffering. And so there's going to be seasons where we're in the valleys, and we have to just know that that's okay, and find a reason to even suffer well when we are suffering. It doesn't mean that we leave things untreated. If somebody's dealing, but in this particular section, we're talking about temporary things and situational things, that we just know that I'm going to do this season of suffering, I'm going to do it well, and I'm going to do it in a way that's still honoring to God and to Jesus in how I go about doing myself.
When I was going through a particularly hard time, I had an aunt of mine who sent me a poem, and basically at the end of it, it was, the mountaintop moments are beautiful, but it's in the valleys that I grow. And in those dark moments, that's when we find the most growth, I think, personally, in our lives.
Jill, you want to add?
The reading I've been doing also says, if I noticed Janice talked about treating the problem, if these things go untreated, especially some of these chemical depressions, and of course Beth's talking about temporary, but if they can become more long-term if you just try to ignore them or slough off the idea. They have to be addressed.
Then that's a really strong point, because we need to, like Beth says, just in the moment acknowledge the sadness, just kind of accept that you are sad, that you have a rough situation going on, and that you can be sad for it, but to then move out of that into a joy, whether it's a small pleasure or not, something like that. Elijah is the story that comes to me. Jezebel, there he was on the mountaintop, on Carmel, but then Jezebel put the hit out on him. He ran, he was exhausted. God said, sleep, here's some food, sleep some more, here's some food. And he moved to a safe area. And then God says, what's going on? What are you here for? And and he said, because they're going to kill me. I'm the only one. And God says, no, I got a bunch of people. Go do this, go do that. And he set Elijah onto doing works for God. And sometimes I think we need rest, we need good food, and we need work to do to get our minds off of that, especially if it's a situation that we can't physically make a change in. God can. And we pray to God, we give that to God, and we go and do the things we can do. And that can be something that can help us. Janice?
Yeah, I think there's also a real need for us to remember that we need each other too. And we can't be coming into our church assemblies just putting on a social mask that says everything is okay. We're going to have to be willing to be vulnerable with one another. We need to learn to weep with each other and to rejoice with each other, and to allow ourselves to, it's a deep vulnerability, but that's when our relationships will knit together as well, and so I think we've got to, if we come in to our times where we're with one another and we're putting on a mask that says, I'm okay, everything's okay, then we're missing an opportunity to really take our interpersonal relationships to another level of being able to support and walk with each other through life.
Right. Absolutely.
Don't you think too that one of the ways that Satan, I think that he uses depression to kind of pick people off is that tendency to get off on your own, because you're just miserable and you just want to be left alone. But when we're alone is when Satan, I think, a lot of times can really work on us, when we have nobody else to help pick us up when we fall.
Right. Because Satan wants us to feel like we're alone, that nobody cares anything about us.
Well, which sheep is easier to pick off, the one that's in the middle of the herd or the one that's all alone?
There you go. Good point. Very good point. one of the ladies that teaches our ladies Bible class, she says almost every time she teaches, this is our safe zone. We love one another. We, and as you said, Janice, we need to be open to one another, and we do need to we need to exude that safeness to our sisters and brothers in Christ, that I'm a person who will listen to you and not judge what you're saying against my prejudice, but against the Bible, and that we need to include one another and give ourselves, be vulnerable. And just doing that sometimes will relieve a certain amount of sadness, especially in a situational problem of depression and sadness. Anybody else before we move on? Very good. Thank you. Jill has been studying seasonal affective disorder or depression. It's often called SAD. And we're getting into that time of the year where this really affects people. What have you learned, Jill?
Well, I tried to stick to reliable websites. Most of the material that I found helpful was from Johns Hopkins University, which is a very respectable medical system.
Yeah.
And I found that, of course, seasonal affective disorder, we always think of it as getting very sad and gloomy when it gets dark early and during the fall and winter months. But there's also a type that's called summer affective disorder, which they didn't go into depth about it, but the symptoms of that are that they tend to come back and then improve about the same time of the year. So this is more of a long-term recurring type of depression, and they think it's probably some chemical imbalance that affects certain people, and just because you happen to get sad when it gets to be wintertime, it may not necessarily be this sad.
Mm-hmm.
It usually starts during adulthood. The risk of SAD increases with age. It's rare in people under 20. Women are affected more often than men. So they link it to melatonin, a sleep-related hormone that the body naturally makes when it gets dark. So when the days are shorter, then you don't have melatonin production in your own system. The symptoms are really a lot like just any other kind of medication, but I think it's important for me to mention what these are because we haven't talked about all the systems. When we think of depression, of course, we think of being sad, but there are other related things. Increased sleep and daytime drowsiness, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, social withdrawal, which is what we just talked about, just wanting to curl up and have everybody leave you alone, and increased sensitivity to rejection. Interesting. Irritability, anxiety, feelings of guilt and hopelessness, fatigue, decreased ability to focus or concentrate, and trouble thinking clearly. They also list increased appetite, weight gain, especially for sweets and carbohydrates, which is what we were just discussing.
That's right.
And weight gain and physical problems such as headaches even can result from this. But I think it's interesting that the treatment for these is pretty much things you can find in the scriptures to help yourself out when you're low. Some things we've already talked about. Of course, with the SAD, one treatment is exposure to sunlight, getting outside, taking walks in the sunlight, getting regular exercise. There is even a light therapy, certain bandwidth, is that bandwidth isn't right? Certain wavelengths of light that help, I guess, produce that melatonin in the body. Of course, they recommend psychotherapy. I'm kind of on the fence about psychotherapy. I think sometimes it probably helps some Christians. I think sometimes it's so worldly oriented, the therapists who work with it, that it may actually pull you away in some ways. So I would be careful about that myself. But I think sometimes it's called for. The main thing is do get help. Sometimes antidepressants are needed. Isla, you talked about the Valium, but you need to be when you go to a doctor and you're discussing these symptoms, don't exaggerate and don't leave things out. The doctor only knows what you tell him.
Right.
And you can bias the doctor by the way you present your symptoms. So, as a Christian woman, I want to be careful about that, because I don't want to be on some medication that I don't need to be on. I don't want to be given advice that's going to pull me away from what I need to be doing. Get help, set realistic goals. Don't try to take on too much. It's not going to go away immediately. And you can't expect that. You have to be patient. How many times do we read that in the scriptures?
Right.
Be patient, break large tasks into small ones, do what you can when you can, and eventually, expect to come out of it. But I think it's so easy to get disappointed if something doesn't work right away. And that could be even more depressing than if you'd done nothing. Try to be with other people. There's our fellowship. And we were talking about staying away from the group, or like you say, wearing a mask when you go in isn't helpful. And confide in someone. And sometimes if you can't think of a single person you can confide in, we always know you can go to God in prayer. And Beth brought up the Psalms. If you don't know what to pray for, go to the scriptures and you'll learn what to say. You'll learn what to say. I'm almost done. Let's see if I can turn one page.
Okay.
And of course, do things that make you feel better. Oh, stay away from alcohol and drugs, because they actually make the symptoms worse.
Right.
And they say that men are more prone to this than women, to get pulled into alcoholism or drug use when they're feeling depressed, because it's not as acceptable in men. So if you have a man who's in your life who's in a state of depression, try to recognize it and help him out, because it's going to be difficult for him to even admit he's got a problem, first of all, and to get support from other people in it. So that's what I learned.
That's good. Very good. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. Most important one, focus on the positive. Philippians 4:8. Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Any other comments? Janice?
Yeah, I would like to understand, why do we have such a stigma around these things? If we're having a physical issue, we go to the doctor and we talk about it. Why is there a stigma around things with regards to depression and any other mental? Our brain is part of our body, right? Like last time I checked, they're all one system. And one of the neuroscientists that I like to listen to, his name is Dr. Andrew Huberman. He has a podcast called Huberman Labs. He's a neuroscientist out of Stanford. He talks a lot about this because he also does ophthalmology as well. And so he talks about the impact of our eye and the importance of light and the circadian rhythms of our body. And it doesn't have to be a sunny day for you to get the light exposure that you need. It can just be being outside. Do it through a window is not enough. The window blocks the rays, the UV rays that we need, the specific wavelength or whatever that is. So it is being outside, but there are ways to get a light box. So because if you're really in an area where it's going to get dark early, is you might not be able to be outside. The weather might be prohibitive of that. But there are ways. He uses a cheap artist light box that he got off of Amazon, and he has it near his computer where he's working. It's not the best way for him to do it, but there are ways to go around this. But one of the things in my food journey, as people I know, why is it that these things feel like a moral failure? Like, it's not okay for me to, if I know I've got this seasonal situation that's going to come, it's not a moral failure on my part. I just need to know what are the strategies I have available that's going to help me through this season. What are the things that I can do to mitigate it? What are the things I can do that help me through it? And what are the ways I can care for myself when I'm in that, where maybe that day, it's not going to be a day where I can take a lot of action. Maybe I can celebrate just the little small actions that I am able to do. I wish I could understand why it feels, for me in my journey, it feels like a moral failure if I'm struggling on it.
And Beth?
I think it feels like that because we can't see it. If someone broke their leg, that's having raised a child who has high functioning autism and is pretty high functioning, very high functioning now, but when he was younger, not so much. But I can't tell you how many people were like, you just need to whip that kid. He had autism and they couldn't see it. They didn't know what the situation was. And to them, it looked like something else was going on. And I think that sometimes people, they can't see what's going on and they make certain assumptions. If someone comes in with a broken leg, you're like, oh, that's pretty obviously an issue if it's a physical thing that shows. But when it's a mental or behavioral thing, people don't see it. And I think sometimes we make assumptions about what other people are going through. And we really have to be careful with that.
And I agree, Beth, because I've noticed, how bad I am to cry about things. And a lot of times at worship services, I'm just almost ashamed of crying because I think, people think I'm sinful. And so that's why I'm crying. But it's because I'm touched by the song or the passage. But I think, like she says, we don't see that. And we make an assumption. Well, if they're crying during an invitation, it's because they're wrong and they don't want to do what's right. And we have to be careful about making those kinds of assumptions. I'm with you, Janice. I would love to know, why is that a problem? Through the years, I have known men and women who would not get any help for an obvious sadness beyond what would, you can kind of pick yourself up out of, but no, they, you didn't do anything like that. But I think what we may not be able to understand why that happens, but what we can do is extend our love to those sisters and brothers who are obviously hurting, or that we think maybe need to talk about a situation of sadness, or that they need to be encouraged to, maybe a visit to your doctor would help, just something we can be that, we can show that love to our brothers and sisters and to others, all the people that we might know. And so I appreciate that perspective of, why is this a problem? I've seen it with people with hearing aids. If you need glasses, nobody has a problem with glasses, it seems like. But if you don't hear well, people won't get hearing aids. Or, I don't know. If you need something for your body, get the help you need. Seems simple. But we've talked about several. Oh, I'm sorry, Beth. I see you.
Okay, so I have to tell y'all, my mother, when I was younger, we had a few moments where she accidentally taught me a very important life lesson. And I don't think she even remembers this conversation, except that I talk about it all the time. When I was in high school, somebody gave me lice. I was horribly embarrassed about it. And Mom was like, we have to go get that lice shampoo. We lived in a small town and everyone would know if we went to the store and bought that. And I said, I'm not doing that. Everyone's going to know. And she told me the shame is not in getting the lice. The shame is in doing nothing about it and holding on to it because you're afraid somebody might find out that you have an issue. If you have something going on with you, there's no shame in a problem like, to me, like a problem like depression, like what we're talking about, or a variety of other things. The shame is in staying in that state out of fear of somebody maybe knowing. Go get help. That's what you need. And it was, but that was an accidental lesson she taught me. But I think it's worth mentioning because I think that's what people do. We're afraid somebody might find out, a variety of things. And the shame is in doing nothing about it because people might know.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Whew. It's good to know I did something right. Even
more than one thing.
even accident. Cindy's going to talk to us about postpartum depression. Cindy has suffered it. Beth has suffered it as well. I always felt like, 50 years ago that I may have, but, it was undiagnosed. But it was another one of those, you just didn't talk about it. Oh, you just got the baby blues. But for some women, it's a real, it's a real big thing, not just a little bit of something. And Cindy's going to talk with us about that.
Yes, I am. Obviously, God says that children are a gift from Him. So I want to just say that from the beginning, because I'm going to be pretty descriptive about how it felt. This is when I was about 20 years old. So having a baby is a gift from God, and it's often, for many people, one of the happiest moments in their lives. And in the end, I can say, even having experienced severe postpartum depression, that becoming a mother was my life. That's okay. But during the transition to motherhood, about half of new mothers actually experience kind of a level of postpartum depression that's called baby blues as the hormones kind of settle. And so this is the one that there might be mood swings that include intense sadness for a few days or weeks after giving birth. So this is that baby blues level of feeling sad. And it generally dissipates rather quickly and does not require any medical help. But for around 10 to 20% of new moms, they will experience a more severe form of depression known as postpartum depression. And that feels much more like despair, anxiety, and irritability. The symptoms are much longer lasting and may occur anytime within the first year. Like you may be okay for a while, but then it kicks in the 9th month or the 6th month. But it will happen like during that first year. Postpartum depression is treated a lot like other types of depression. We've talked about support, counseling, talk therapy, medications. And treatment, of course, depends on the nature and the severity of the postpartum depression. And it's just important to recognize that it is both temporary. Like it feels like, am I ever going to feel any different? It is temporary. Yeah, this treatable. So that's the good news. You won't always feel this way. But without medical attention, as symptoms worsen, they can really interfere with your daily life. And so that's the kind that I experienced. But before I go into my story, you guys should also know about postpartum psychosis. So that's a third level that's much, much more severe and very different than the baby blues or postpartum depression, in that it may cause a mother to completely lose with reality. And in these cases, she may even have thoughts of harming herself or her child. Often women who have already been battling some mental illness have a much higher risk of developing postpartum psychosis. and often need more intense help to recover, including counseling and and education on how to like reduce stress and those kinds of things. Those are like 3 levels. So my story, and I guess I'm going to be very candid here, and I think Janice has kind of pointed out the value of that, let's tell our stories of what it feels like. Like, I can relate to you if you've been through this. When I was 20 years old, I mean, I was happily married and had been for about 3 years. We owned our own home. I'd given birth to my first child. I mean, this gorgeous baby girl, blue-eyed, thick head of blonde hair. Many of my dreams had come true, but for the first few months of my daughter's life, to be candid, I did not feel like living. And I think for me, it was a kind of the perfect storm. For one thing, I was 20 years old when I had her, so I was a relatively young mother. And any of these things in and of themselves don't matter. But for me, in my case, I feel like it was cumulative. So maybe some listeners tonight can relate to some of these. But I mean, I was a free spirit who was about to like buckle down now for 18 years or forever. And, so I was really feeling that sacrifice of like, okay, the sacrifices involved in being a mom. So that kind of hit me hard. I gave birth in the darkest, gloomiest, wettest month of Oregon in November, middle of November. My recovery was slow from giving birth because I had been in labor for 18 hours, followed by a C-section. So it was a slow recovery. I mean, genetically, I come from a long line of women on my mother's side. I mean, brilliant women who accomplished a lot in life, but worked hard to keep their brain chemistry well balanced. And so I could go into details on that just now. I mean, generationally, having good brain chemistry always 100% of the time, that was something that the women in my family kind of had to work at. And so I had spent these 6 months when I was 20 years old, how long I really struggled with having good brain chemistry. My baby had the colic was so bad that they gave her this green medicine to try to relax her intestines, is what they said. So she's screaming. I feel guilty about the social expectation of breastfeed when my baby was always much fuller and happier on Playtex nurse or bottle. So I've got this inner conflict of like, oh, I'm doing the thing. I'm, not respected by the other moms. Like this, you really should be doing the other thing. And I think in addition, I was really deeply missing mental stimulation that I got from working outside the home and felt super guilty for not enjoying what the other women seemed to be enjoying in these early stages. And deep down, I think I was kind of afraid that God was no longer smiling on my life because perhaps my depression it felt like ingratitude. So the truth is, becoming a mother was one of the best decisions that I ever made. But to say it was a hard adjustment is an understatement. Finding the right medicine to me was kind of like Goldilocks and the three bears. Like the first one knocked me out. And I'm saying this for the people that have come to the realization tonight, I think I need some medicine. I'm here to say you may need to try several until you find the one that is what your brain needs. So the first one knocked me out. That wasn't going to work. The second one actually gave me hives head to toe. But the third medicine was just right because it doesn't make you feel happy. It's not like happy medicine. I was glad, Isla, that you introduced us talking about Valium. We're not talking about that. It was just right when I got the right medicine, my brain became normal. It was just, I would describe it. And so I did it for about 6 months and was able to take it off of it and have stayed. I would have stayed on it forever if that's what was needed. So there's nothing morally superior to being on it shorter than 6 months. I'm just saying for me, it kind of taught my brain it helped my brain remember what the chemicals were that it forgot it had been keeping from me. And I have a Harvard quote that I won't have time to get into, but that's been confirmed by science. When you take your postpartum depression medicine, when you take your depression medicine, sometimes it helps the brain produce naturally, and then you can taper off. Sometimes not. Here's the interesting part that I'm kind of running out of time here, but here's the interesting part that really taught me something indispensable that I hope will be of value to the listeners tonight. About 6 years after my bout with postpartum depression, I lost a full-term baby and definitely, obviously, had deep grief, but no depression. And so I could really feel that difference between what it feels like to grieve a loss, kind of what Beth has discussed tonight, and chemical imbalance, postpartum depression. A year after that, I lost another full-term baby. And again, same thing, grieved deeply, but had no depression. Because here's the thing I learned, there's a world of difference between being super sad in circumstances and imbalanced brain chemistry. And I'm here to say, if you need medicine, here's my main point. If you need medicine, please take it with a clear conscience, like you would any other physical problem, because brain chemistry is a physical problem. And when it's out of balance, just like diabetes or heart disease. So that was the main thing that I wanted to encourage our listeners, that if you need that, do not feel guilty for it. It's what you need, and your whole family's better off. Your baby's better off. Your family and those that love you and want to support you, they would say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
On the medicine if you need it.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. I think we'd all agree with that for sure. Well, Cindy, we've talked about several different kinds of depression and some ways that we can treat that. Or can you wrap us up on this discussion of dealing with depression?
Yes, I would say, and the ladies, I had things to say for all of you, like, oh, you guys really did a good job, and I love you. Really have already given some very practical things that we can do, but I'm just going to reiterate a handful of things. Daily Bible reading. Stay in communion with the great physician. It's not just a rote thing that you do, it's transformative. Listen, and I think the Psalms, Beth, that's a great idea of like, here's David's deep grief. Like, you can relate to that and his dependence on God to kind of shift his thinking in that, and then to see, he comes to the realization, it is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn thy statutes, So daily Bible reading, don't skip it. Prayer. Pour your heart out. And I love how Janice was like, pour your heart out to your friends. And I have poured my heart out to Janice McDonald probably as much as anyone else. Yes, one another and to God, both. In fact, both of you get together and do what Janice and I do. Both of us get together and we pour it out to God together, but tell him everything. Sleep, we've talked about, maybe you need a friend to come over and be with the baby so that you can take a nap today. Ask for the help that you need to catch up on your sleep. Nutrition, Janice has covered. Exercise. Sweating. It's so interesting, Janice, isn't it? Like endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, like to do a little research on that. And some of that comes from exercise. Some of it comes from physical affection, of love, of, holding that baby or being near your husband. So relationships, express your emotion, even find new interesting things to pursue. I think that's super good for brain chemistry. So I'll keep that brief there, Isla. And so that would be a wrap up of some things we can do specifically to address each kind of depression.
Great. Thank you so much. And we invite our viewers to add comments or questions in the Facebook notes where you can put that information on. If you would like to private message us, we would be glad to talk with you, perhaps to offer what we know of as resources or help to point you in the right direction. We would be glad to talk with you about this subject and any other subject that's a Bible subject for women. Thank you again, ladies, for being part of this discussion this evening. And we hope that we have been of some help to our Christian sisters in the world, and that those that need to some help in relative to depression. Next week, we are going to have several younger women on the program with us, with Cindy and me, and we're going to be talking about the youthful, virtuous woman. I've always just had my mental picture in Proverbs 31 of the virtuous woman as at least middle-aged, maybe even older, and but here are these young women that we're going to talk with them about what does it look like at your age, in your 20s or early 30s, or even in your teens. How can you be that youthful, virtuous woman? So tune in next Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern for the discussion of the youthful, virtuous woman. Remember also on Tuesday evening to join in on Answering Religious Errors at 8 o'clock, Keeping My Head On Straight. Some wonderful discussions of ways that we can continue to learn about God, to learn of his commandments, and to do what we need to do in this life and keep our heads on straight. On Wednesdays, question and answer. Be sure to tune in at noon on Wednesdays, again, Eastern time, and to have questions of a Bible nature answered. So these are all programs in addition to many others that are available for, and our programs are archived. You can go back and watch any of them. We encourage you to go back to Janice's program from way back in the way back, that for older women likewise. So thank you, ladies, again for being with us tonight, and thank you, viewers, for being with us, and we will say good night.